every single generation has said and continues to say before their own children sit down for dinner time. Did you wash your hands? I mean, let's face it, kids can be super gross sometimes. And hygiene is really important, especially in today's day and age. And so it's every parent's responsibility to make sure that their kids wash their hands before eating. So I didn't get what the big deal was. But based on his harsh reaction, there has to be more than a simple concern for the disciples' lack of personal hygiene at play here. Whatever the motivation is that led them to ask why his disciples didn't wash their hands, their motivation has to be what has Jesus so upset, that he would actually dare to say to the religious leaders of his day that they honor God with their lips, but their hearts are far from God. That's a pretty harsh indictment that Jesus offers. So what was their motivation? Why did they ask that question? Why did it cause Jesus to react the way that he did? And then what is the lesson in all of that for us? So let me ask you this. How many of you who have been coming to St. Jude's for a while now, how many of you tend to sit in the same pew whenever you are here? Even if you don't put up your hand, I know who you are because I'm looking at you every week. You are not alone if you do that. There are Anglicans everywhere in churches all over the world where it has become their tradition to sit in the same pew whenever they go to church to worship God. When I was up in Sault Ste. Marie this summer, I knew before I even walked in the doors with my parents where we would be sitting for church that Sunday. It's tradition. It was no different in my last parish. Most people, they sit in the same spot every week. And there is nothing wrong with that. Until there is something wrong with that. I remember this one Sunday in a previous parish, we had a young family come to worship with us for the first time. And let's face it, what Anglican church isn't going to get super excited if a young family comes walking in the doors when they see that new young family come in? Of course we're going to get excited and want to make them feel welcome. So this family, they nervously and they tentatively made their way inside the church. They were welcomed warmly by the greeters. They were handed a bulletin. And then they looked around and they found an empty pew near the back to sit. They won't be noticed if they're sitting at the back. They won't stand out. A few minutes later, a longtime member of the congregation came into the church, marches right over to them, and ordered them to move because they were sitting in her spot. After all, in her mind, after all, she had been coming to that church and she had been sitting in that pew for her whole life. And these people, who do they possibly think they are? What right do they have showing up here all of a sudden out of the blue and sitting in her pew? Do you think we ever saw that family again? No. And again, I hear Jesus say, just like he did to the Pharisees and the scribes, this people, they honor God with their lips, or by showing up to church and sitting in the same pew week in and week out to worship God. They honor God with their lips and their traditions, but sometimes their hearts are far from God. That tradition of sitting in the same pew, that wasn't the problem. The problem is that this woman, she had lost sight of the fact that the reason for the tradition in the first place, the reason why she came to church, The reason that she sat in that same pew for all of those years, it was to worship God. It was to give thanks to God. And it wasn't a reward or a right that she had earned for what a good and faithful Christian she had been by coming to church all those years. Observing that tradition of sitting in the same pew each week, for her, it had stopped being about God. It had stopped being about worship, stopped being about giving thanks. And it had become all about her own sense of entitlement. I think it's the same sort of thing that Jesus is reacting to in today's gospel. The Pharisees and the scribes, they had always understood that the law and the commandments that God had given to the people of Israel, they had always understood that that was nothing but a gift. God gave the law and the commandments to be a gift to the people. And they had also understood that observing the law and being faithful to the commandments that God had given, they had understood that was not about earning anything from God. It was not about doing them in order to get something from God for good behavior. But it was a way that the people of Israel, it was one of the ways that being faithful to the commandments and the laws, it was one of the ways that they could give glory to God. It was for them worship. Being faithful to the law and the commandments was a way of worshiping and showing honor and giving thanks to God. That was originally the motivation for observing the law and the commandments. Now, in Jewish tradition, no one was ever permitted to go into the temple unless they were considered to be ritually clean. And that's because going into the temple represented coming into the very presence of God. And as a way of showing respect to God, you were required to do what was necessary in order to make yourself ritually clean before you would come into God's presence. And that's where the tradition of washing one's hands before eating comes in. Technically, the rules that are all about the washing of hands, technically those rules, they only applied to the priests who served in the temple. They were required to wash their hands before entering the holy place or before offering a sacrifice to make sure that they were clean before they came into God's presence. But the Pharisees and the scribes, they took it a step further. They had always thought that this tradition of washing hands, that it should not just apply to the priests. They thought that it should apply to every single faithful Jew, and that everyone should wash their hands before they sat down to eat, as a way of making every meal a holy moment, as a way of making and acknowledging that every aspect of life gives us an opportunity to realize that we are in God's presence. The tradition of washing one's hands before each meal, it was intended to prepare oneself. It was a way to worship. It was a way to show honor and respect and to give thanks to God in all aspects of life. That was the original intention and motivation for why they would wash their hands. Jesus' harsh reaction when they asked him why his disciples don't wash their hands before eating, it's because he could sense that they had lost touch with the original intention of this tradition. The problem with the Pharisees and the scribes, according to Jesus, was that they had become so focused on their external displays of faithfulness, like keeping the commandments. Look at me, I keep the commandments. Or following the rules. or observing the traditions of the elders, or showing up regularly for worship at church. They had become so focused on these external displays of faithfulness that they had lost the proper perspective on why it was they did those things in the first place. They had become so focused on these external displays that they had forgotten to take time to examine their own hearts and to reflect on their own motivations for why they do what they do. It had stopped being about worship. It had stopped being about honoring and giving thanks to God. And it had become all about them. The rituals they observed, like the washing of hands, no longer showing honor and worship to God, but rather, here's what it did. They washed their hands to be ritually clean. It made them feel superior to others who didn't wash their hands. It gave them the opportunity to look down with judgment on those that they themselves deemed to be unclean, like the disciples in today's gospel. Their efforts to live faithfully, they were in fact putting up walls of alienation instead of drawing them closer to God and to their neighbors. The rituals they observed were creating this sort of spiritual hierarchy between the clean and the unclean. And so instead of showing honor and worship to God, their efforts at ritual purity through the washing of hands, it actually became a means by which they excluded other people. They excluded those they considered dirty or contaminated. And that's why Jesus reacted the way that he did. You honor God with your lips. You honor God by observing all these traditions and these laws. But your hearts and your motivations, they're so far from God sometimes. So here's where all this applies to us. Just like the Pharisees, because the Pharisees are good people. Let's not paint them as the evil ones. We're just like the Pharisees. And just like the Pharisees, we believe that being called to the life of faith, we believe that following Jesus is a gift that God has given to us. And in response to God's gift of grace in our lives, in response to the gift of faith that each one of us has been blessed with, we want to live our lives, or at least I hope we do. We want to live our lives in a way that God would have us live. And we try to discern what that looks like in the everyday, regular moments of our lives. The danger which the Pharisees and the scribes fell into. The danger is that as we are attempting to live faithfully, as we are trying to live as God would have us live, as that way of showing honor and thanks to God, there's that danger, there's that temptation to judge those who do not live the same way that we do. The temptation to begin to see ourselves above others because of how faithfully we are living. There's even the temptation to start to believe that because of how faithfully we are living our lives, that we are more deserving of God's love and grace than others who don't live up to our own standards of faithfulness that we have set for ourselves. Certainly the lady I told you about earlier thought she was more deserving of that seat than those who had just come in for the first time. All of this is why it is so important for each of us from time to time to search our own hearts, to reflect on our own motivations. I think Jesus is telling us, be aware when piety or when external displays of faithfulness to God, be aware of when living out your faith gets in the way of fulfilling the heart of what the Christian faith is supposed to be about. The Christian faith is always supposed to be about the other, loving God, loving neighbor, with all of our heart, our mind, our soul. He warns us to be aware of those times when our own attempts at faithfulness actually separate us from others, or leads us to be judging others, because when that happens, our hearts are far from God. Today's gospel makes it clear that Jesus, he can see, he sees clearly the sometimes ugliness of our human hearts and motivations. And yet the good news, because the gospel is always good news. The good news is that despite the fact that Jesus can see our sometimes ugly hearts and less than noble motivations, he never turns away from us. He sees right through the highly edited versions of ourselves that we present to the world, sees through our external displays of faithfulness. He knows what motivations lurk within us. But he still loves us. And he invites us to learn from him. In the larger story of the gospel, Jesus shows us what true faithfulness is by daring to touch those who we often declare to be unclean, by daring to love those we often label as social outcasts, by loving and serving and giving his life for all people. There was the tax collectors he made friends with. There were the lepers he was willing to touch. There were the demon-possessed that he didn't cross the road to get away from. There were the Pharisees and the scribes that even though he got frustrated with them, he still engaged them in dialogue, loving and serving all people, because that is how he showed honor and gives glory to his Father. And following his example is how we show honor and give glory to God. Amen.